Pardon me. Let me interrupt the discourse that you all are engaging in. I'm sure that it's brilliant and certainly worthy. My iPad is taking control of my life. I'm sorry. If you don't know me, I am Dennis Longmire, chair of this year's committee that oversees the College of Criminal Justice's Distinguished Lecture Series. Before we do get started, please mute or turn off all of your electronic devices or those things that might interfere with the transmission of the lecture. I'm also going to ask that you hold all of your questions until Dr. Belknap's lecture is finished. I will be walking around with this microphone, and in order for us to capture your question on the recording of this, you need to have the mic, and so please hold off. Raise your hand, let me know you have a question, and if you haven't seen Phil Donahue, I will imitate him and I will run to you with the microphone and throw it into your mouth. So please cooperate. Also want to remind all of the graduate students that immediately following the lecture there is an informal colloquium. I want to underline the word informal colloquium, where you guys can talk with Dr. Belknap about anything and everything that comes to your mind. It is going to be held in the Bates Room immediately following the lecture, and then after that we will break for lunch. I don't know how lunch is going to operate, whether we will eat in the C Java room or whether we'll take our plates and go back into the Bates Room. We have to be impromptu with that particular decision. Also, if you haven't, at the C Java, when you get your food, make sure to sign the sign-in sheet so that Dean Webb will pay for the meal. Otherwise, you're stealing, and that's not appropriate. On behalf of the College of Criminal Justice's faculty and dean, I want to welcome everyone to this morning's lecture. This is the fourth and final Beto Chair lecture being presented this academic year. The first lecturer for next year's series will be Professor David Kennedy from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and it will be held on Friday, October 18th. So please mark your calendars and be ready for a good presentation by Dr. Kennedy. You all know, I'm sure you've heard of it before, but the Distinguished Lecture Series is funded by the Houston Endowment Corporation. We need to thank them for their funding. They provided funds that were specifically dedicated to bring scholars in our field to campus to help enlighten and enhance the education of our doctoral students. We've had numerous distinguished scholars. At one time, the lecture series brought the scholars to campus for a full semester, and we had Jerome Skolnick, we had Dorothy Bracey, we had Sue Titus Reed, Cy Denitz at that time. And about 4 years after that, the lecture series converted to the lecturer rather than the in-residence series, and we've had over 90 distinguished scholars join us since that time. I am not going to formally introduce Dr. Belknap, but instead one of our own distinguished professors in the making, Dr. Kelly Knight, will do so.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see all of you. As some of you may know, Dr. Joanne Belknap is a mentor of mine. I took one of my first graduate classes with her at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she is a full professor of sociology. She was kind enough to serve on my dissertation committee and write many, many letters of recommendation, so thank you for that. Prior to moving to Boulder, with her partner, Dr. Belknap was an associate professor of both criminal justice and women's studies at the University of Cincinnati for nearly a decade. Over a decade. Dr. Belknap received her doctorate in criminal justice and criminology from Michigan State University. One of the most valuable things that I have observed from Dr. Belknap and have tried to model myself is the importance that she places on teaching undergraduate students. She has developed and taught over a dozen undergraduate classes, such as race, class, crime and gender, violence against women and girls, hate crimes, and female offenders. And these are classes that many of our students today take as a given. In addition, she has taught over a dozen graduate level classes, including Women, the Law, and Social Control, and Feminist Research Methods, which I was lucky enough to take from her. In addition to her love for teaching, Jo is a master at both the art of scholarship and the science of advocacy. She has published in numerous journals and books, too many to list out. She is the president-elect of the American Society of Criminology. She is the new chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. And she is the recipient of several teaching, research, and service awards. Before I wrap up, I just want to mention two of the awards she's received. The first, which is one of my favorite, is the Inconvenient Woman of the Year Award, which is given by the American Society of Criminology Division on Women and Crime. And it's an award given to someone for doing what is unpopular but necessary. She won it for speaking out for college women reporting rapes. The second award I want to mention, she actually told me not to discuss, but I'm going to do it anyway. She's the recipient of the Western States Mountain Dew Vertical Challenge Snowboard Race for Women. How awesome is that? So just to end, I want to remind everyone that long before it was trendy to call oneself a victimologist or to start a victim studies program, Jo was a trailblazer, and the field is much better for her, so thank you. And Jo, thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to speak with us today. We really appreciate it. So please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Joanne Belknap.
Thank you. Okay, so I think you keep that. Oh, okay, can you hear me okay? I'm all wired up here. First of all, it's so great to see a bunch of faces of people I already know from so many different places in my life. And I thoroughly enjoyed my ride from the airport yesterday with Bridget and Maria, and my wonderful dinner last night, and breakfast this morning. And I am so impressed with this university on so many levels and what everybody's doing, and the funding for doctoral students and the mentoring. It's just really so impressive. So I just want to start out by saying that. Second, I'm getting over a cold, so sorry if I'm a little nasally here. So what I'm going to talk about today is this study that was funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And I have in here Joanne Belknap and research team, because this really was a study that took a village to pull off. And what we did, the principal investigator on the grant was Shannon Lynch. I'm the only non-psychologist on here, and this was a major learning curve for me. It was fascinating, but a major learning curve, still learning. Shannon Lynch, it was a principal investigator, and it was Women's Pathways to Jail was the name of the grant, the RFP and the grant. And she's at Idaho State University, and Dana DeHart is at the University of South Carolina. They were the co-PI and PI. And the RFP came out saying, we know because of this study by Stedman that the rates of women in jails were for serious mental illness were twice as high, about 31 to 32% for women compared to men. That they wanted to the goal of the RFP was to not look at the gender differences, but to look at the onsets of trauma and serious mental illness where those things, where the women had those. And the most I had done in studying, I'd done a lot on studying trauma, although doing it in a more sociological, bumbling along, qualitative way for the most part, and then but where I did use quantitative, I used mostly self-esteem studies, which, as we know, or the Rosenberg, not a really great mental health measure. So this was definitely really, really new for me. And then Bonnie Green, who's at Georgetown University. And then I'd also want to say we had a number of graduate students and undergraduate students who worked on the study doing so many things that I can't list all of them, but these were the four main other people that were responsible for collecting data at the different sites, and just did, it was one of those things you think, it was a $500,000 grant, and you could never do this kind of study without funding. It was just amazing. And so I'm very grateful for the funding as well. So looking at just the pathways theory of looking at this connection between victimization and offending, part of it with the goal of the RFP, the request for proposals for the grant, and for what we were doing was trying to look at first of all, this cycling between trauma and offending, but also the part of this cycling is also coming in and out of jails and prisons, and what are the unique challenges for women who have mental health issues? What are the challenges for their children, which I'm not going to be able to talk as much about, and this was more them talking about it. We did not interview the children, but we did also interview the staff, which if I have time today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the things the staff said. The communities in which they live, how that affects their communities, and the law enforcement jail administration, that was supposed to be corrections officers. And then to understand the risk reduction and programming needs, we need information on how trauma and serious mental illness relate to each other and the onset of offending. So the main research questions we're looking at: what are the current and lifetime prevalence of serious mental illness? What's the lifetime exposure to violence and adversity, trauma? To what extent does serious mental illness co-occur with PTSD and substance use disorders? The levels of impairment associated with serious mental illness in women offenders. To what extent do serious mental illness women in jail have access to treatment prior to incarceration? And to what extent do the pathways of women with serious mental illness differ from other women in jail? So the research design was multi-site, and that was the RFP called for, that this needed to be a multi-site US study. And so Shannon Lynch just got on the phone and called 4 people. Only one person said no, they didn't want to try to do this. I told her my biggest concern was I had tried numerous times to do studies, as well. My colleague Hillary Potter and I both have tried numerous times to do studies on women in prisons in Colorado. And Hillary got farther along than I did, but then at the last minute they would say we couldn't go in and collect data, and even though it wasn't even about their experiences in prison, which those who've done, I see some nodding heads, research on women in prison, it is so much harder to get into women's prisons. I had a lot of problems in Ohio with this when I was at the University of Cincinnati. But anyway, so I said, well, I'll try the jails, we'll see. And Chief Diggins at the Denver County Jail was so wonderful. It was one of those just really encouraging, I had to go through and talk to the psychologists there about the study, and they had to make sure they were okay with everything we were doing, but they really got on board. And these kind of connections are so important for those of us doing this research, and I am so indebted to Chief Diggins because he was just so open to the research and when I reported on our findings, the initial ones last summer, he had a whole lot of the staff come, especially people at the top. So nurturing those relationships is very important. So in Colorado, the main site, well, the only site was the Denver County Jail. And in Washington, D.C., it was a couple of different jails in Maryland, Virginia area. These were all urban jails, and the Denver, obviously, just the one jail. But and then in Idaho and South Carolina, they were more rural jails, and that was part of what we wanted to say. Let's look at some of this stuff. We had this $10 incentive to participate. The women were randomly sampled at each of the jails. But the IRBs, which it could be a whole presentation in itself, but I had the most IRB problems, but they didn't have a problem with paying the women. We could put the money in their canteen. At Idaho, they were only allowed to put buy books worth $10, self-help books, which the women just so wanted to read in those jails, maybe not. So participation, these kind of things would affect participation. I did find in my study, or in my part with the Denver jail, that a lot of them owed money in their canteens, which was news to me, but then I've been reading about this more, and other people study that even to send a kite, they had to pay for it, unless they thought they were suicidal, to send a kite to the medical facility, and if they didn't have this money, it would just get charged to their account, so they could end up owing phone calls, everything. And so a lot of the women, which I, just on principle, when I brought them in, they said, well, I already owe $50, and I said, well, we have to pay it towards that's the only thing. And they said, no, unless it's coming right to me, I'm not doing your study. So just those participation things I think are important to look at for these kinds of studies. So we did mixed methods with the women. We had 491 women who participated in what we call the CD, or the structured interview, which was I always forget the name of this, the Composite international diagnostic interview. We were originally going to use the SCID, if people know that, and then we had like a disagreement. This was for the most mental health and trauma stuff. So we had 491 women that took part in that 22% decline rate. And then of those 491 women, they were all randomly sampled. We randomly sampled from those to take part in life history calendars. The final thing we did, which I probably am not going to have time to talk about, but actually was really, really another interesting part of this, was interviewing staff about their opinions about trauma and gender and serious mental illness. And the findings were actually kind of surprising to me from that too. So if I have time, I'll talk about that too. Somehow I missed, I had a theory slide on here and I must have accidentally deleted it. But the pathways, suddenly it's beginning called theory now. It's called perspective and all this. I don't know why we don't call it theory, kind of like the life course perspective, when we've had so much research that verifies this connection between trauma and life events, significant life events as risk factors for offending. And I keep saying that I'm not sure at what point are we allowed to call something a theory, and why are people so resistant with some things. But Kathy Spatz-Whittem, with her amazing work with the cycle of violence in 1989, I always tell people that I remember where I was sitting when I read that article. I just was so struck with her work. I think she's just so amazing in what she's done. But with a lot of these different types of study, theoretical or perspective-driven studies, we definitely see this risk factor of trauma, which includes different kinds of victimization, certainly different types of child abuse and neglect, as risk factors for offending. Just as important to understand how they are risk factors for offending, we really need to understand what are those protective things that go on, because as Kathy Spatz-Whittem found in her original, there's plenty of kids that were, even though it was a risk factor for offending, there are lots of kids who have those that don't become offenders. So what's going on in their lives? So I think those are important things to keep in mind here. So with this study, the main measure was this CD, and that the World Health Organization uses. And we had a lot of different modules in this packet that we used for the 491 women that were in the first wave. And, but the serious mental illnesses we looked at were bipolar depression, we also looked at PTSD, and then we looked at substance use, dependence, schizophrenia, and psychotic spectrum, and then we used the life history calendars. In the CD sample, the women were aged 17 to 62. The average age was 35. The average income prior to incarceration was $17,000 a year. 75% of the women in our study had children under 18. This didn't necessarily mean that the children had been living with them before they came to jail, which is something we need to tease out of here at some point. But for 24%, it was their first offense. So I think to me the more important thing is 76%. This, as my favorite staff member, the Dr. Denise Vargas, the head psychologist for the women's section, kept saying this is not their first rodeo. And so a lot of the women, some of the things, when we interviewed the staff, they said there were times in there that they had a woman, daughter, and granddaughter all in the jail at the same time. Yeah, pretty amazing. One of my graduate students is working on a paper she presented at ASC last year from the life history calendars looking at mothering, and it's fascinating about. She first became interested in doing the life history calendars, how the women that she was interviewing talked about their mothers. And then once she started analyzing the data, she became interested in how they talked about being mothers and then also about being grandmothers, and even the women who hadn't had children yet. So it's really interesting. I'm eager for her to get that done. The average number of prior convictions that the sample had was 3.7. The race, it was fairly equal, white and African American, Latina, American Indian, and other. The education, about 4% had no high school. about a quarter had some high school, and about a third had completed high school or GED. A lot of these were women who'd completed GEDs either in delinquent institutions or in prison or halfway houses or places like that. And there were about 28% who had had some college, and 6 or 7% had a college degree, and like 3% that had at least started graduate school, and some had finished. Note to the graduate students in here, right? With this, when we looked at what their charges were for this particular target jail time, what the charges were, the single biggest one was probation and parole violation. And the next most common was the drug possession. The parole and probation violation were almost all violations of charges that were originally drug charges. They weren't completely that, but they were mostly drug charges. And a lot of these were things like not showing up for their routine visit with a probation or parole officer, not making it to have a urinalysis test. And a lot of these stories were really heartbreaking to hear. And people always say to me every time I present, well, how do you know they were telling the truth? And of course, you don't always know they're telling the truth. But as one day, I was telling at dinner last night that one of my graduate students, Beth Whaley, was interviewing in the room next to me, and I kept forgetting things and going in. And the woman in the jail that she was interviewing said, "My God, you're a mess." And so we all laughed. And then Beth posted on my Facebook page that night how this had happened, and said, "This from a woman with 13 felonies." And then one of my other former undergraduate students wrote, "If you want the truth, ask a drunk, a felon, or a child." And I always thought that is so true, right? And sometimes they might be a combination of those. I was actually amazed at a lot of the things, and I feel like this every time I do this research, that I am amazed at a lot of the times people will tell you even really despicable things they have done doing this research. And usually not proudly. That's with a lot of shame and sorrow. That once in a while proudly, but anyway, with the probation and parole violations, one of the women that I interviewed, she had embezzled, and my memory is something like $20,000. It was something like 6 years before, but she was still on probation. She was a single parent of 3 children. She had had no records since then, but she was still on probation. And she had, on our light rail system, could not find her pass. And it kind of works on an honor system that you are supposed to, buy your ticket for the light rail bus system if you don't have a pass. And it was $275 or $375. And even if she were lying and she really hadn't bought it, but this is what she got busted for, she ended up in jail for, it was 6 or 9 months. And, so even though she'd had this completely clean record up until then. So to me, and a lot of this, we're talking about just this bootstrapping people back into the system, and it does seem to be gendered to me, although I could be wrong about this, but from reading other people's research, just these ways that women have less access to cars. A lot of women just, said, "Oh my gosh, my mom was supposed to come pick me up to take me to my UA, and she forgot, or the car wasn't working, or whatever." So this was a huge issue. And then drug possession second, but so many of those in the top one. Of this, 16% that were charged with waiting for violent offenses, and a lot of these were domestic violence charges. Some of the women we talked to were very clear on how abusive they were to their mates, but most of them, it was quite different than that. A lot of them that just, Beth one time, one of the women she interviewed, that her abuser that she had been involved with had sliced her throat and left her in a garbage container, and she had this just huge scar all the way around her neck. There were just really awful things like that. One of the women, when I was leaving, one of my graduate students said, "She wants to meet you." And I went in, she said, "Look at my ID picture." And her face was really, really badly beaten up in her jail ID picture. She had been in jail a number of years before for DUI. Her abusive mate was beating her up one night, and she grabbed the car keys, did not see her wallet, jumped in the car, and was pulled over because her license plate came up as somebody who was on probation parole. And she didn't have a driver's license, so that meant 9 months in jail. And even though her face was completely beaten up, but she said, I couldn't go get my, so there were just so many stories like this. It was really humbling. There was only one sexual offense person, and this was kind of interesting in this case because it was someone who was mentally disabled that I'm trying to remember, I think she was like 19 or 20, and she had been having sex with a 15-year-old boy or something that the age was enough in whatever state this one was in, and she became pregnant, and so the boy's mother charged her with statutory rape. So anyway, there are lots of little interesting things in here. With the exposure to violence and adversity, you can see here 40% had some kind of child physical abuse, about 45% child sexual abuse, witnessing violence. This is one thing that the research is getting more and more looking at about what is the impact of this. And I have to say, I was really amazed how much this came up, because a lot of times we would go, in the CD interview, we went through all these different kind of things, and then after it would say, you listed these different events. Which one do you feel like impacted you, that had the most negative impact on you? And it was amazing how much the witnessing of the violence, even with people who had really awful ones, but witnessing murders was a lot of them, and there were some really gruesome stories. But one of the women told me about just being, she said, I think I was about 6, and my brother, who was 8, I could see him hiding behind a garbage can in our back. I'm looking out the window, and he's hiding behind a garbage can. I'm like, what is he doing? And he's like, and of course that only makes me want to go out more. But so she goes, I sneak out there, and there's these guys holding some other guys with a gun across the alley. And she said, we watched them just murder these guys. And of course, we're terrified. So we just wait till they drive off and go inside. But she said, it wasn't the kind of thing you call the police or anything, because you don't, even at that age, we knew we were at risk. So another woman I interviewed, she'd had a horrible life, but her thing that she said was the worst was one of the first times that she was in jail, that she was with this guy, and he had just like this road rage thing going, and stopped with this other person, and then shot and killed the person. And then she was charged as being an accessory, and she didn't even know he had a gun on him. But she was saying it was so traumatic to watch somebody murdered right in front of your eyes. So I think we don't have enough. And a lot of this was stuff that children experienced, and sometimes people knew about it, and sometimes they didn't. Adult attack or robbed, and that was about 38%, and this was most of the women that ended up being living on the streets a lot of times. That was an inevitable part of that life. Sexual assault as an adult, over 40%. When they were growing up, having a caregiver in jail was 70%, and having a caregiver with an addiction, again, was a huge problem here, about 60%. And obviously when you look at this, you can see these class-based, how this can be very class-based, who has access to get counseling and different things for this, or whose parents can go to the Betty Ford Center. They're not in our study, that kinds of things. So I just think that's really important to look at. So in this slide, this has all 4 of the sites, with this one on this end being all of the sites, and then divided by state. And the number I have up here is what the percent was for what it was at all sites. And so if there was any serious mental illness, and this was prevalence over the lifetime, because we also looked at incidence measuring it as the prior 12 months. So 43% had any serious mental illness. And when I'm saying serious, I have a whole new appreciation for this. A lot of the work that I've done mostly when I'm reviewing other people's research, but it's just this whole history of pathologizing women who are in prison. And it was kind of interesting to be on this other end of it this time, of saying, oh my gosh, we pathologize women if they fight back against their abusers, and we, all these things that we pathologize women offenders that we don't pathologize men for. At the same time, this whole, some of the questions that we had with the trigger, or I can't think of the name of it, but the question to trying to get them into the sequencing to see if they'd experienced these different things. So with the serious mental illness, one of the first questions was, have you ever heard voices that other people can't hear, and it's not, and it wasn't when you were sleeping or drinking or on drugs, and my graduate students and I, none of us psychologists, we were always talking about that we would try to, we started kind of having this game with ourselves to see if we could figure out who was going to be seriously mentally ill when they walked in the room, and how often we were wrong in both directions. But some of the stories were really incredible. One of them that really stuck out for me is this woman that I was interviewing, and she was in there because she had knifed somebody in the drug treatment program she was in, and cut her up pretty bad. And she was telling me, she said, I have this thing where I can, this was one of the answers to one of the other questions, but she said, I can see when people are evil. And she said, I've been able to do this since I was like 11 or something. And so I said, well, can you explain that to me? And she said, well, like the woman that I just knifed, we were really good friends. I mean, that's why people were just so surprised. But I didn't realize she was really evil. It took me longer to figure it out. And she was talking to me one day, and this is a lot of what happens. I just start seeing these scales, these dark green, blue scales just going up her arms, going up her whole body, and horns coming out. And that's when I knew. And she kept talking. And it's like, I can see, I know now. And it was really incredible. And part of what some of the women would talk about, that their families had nothing to do with them anymore, and you could really understand why, especially their children whose lives they had made a mess of. I mean, it was really heartbreaking. One of the last women I interviewed said, I get out of jail or prison and I go to see my daughter, and she's like, no, you're not coming and ruining mine and my kid's life again, bye. And you can totally understand that, especially if you have children, why somebody would do that. But it also, I mean, one of our big things that we talk about here is not having mental illness institutions is just such a huge problem. The PTSD was 53%, the substance use disorder 82%. Having both, I knew that was going to happen. Okay, it probably won't be the first time. The PTSD and SUD, 46%. A serious mental illness and PTSD, 29% comorbidity. Serious mental illness and SUD, 38%. Again, a lot of people self-medicate. And the SMI and PTSD, all three of these was 26% of the sample, which is just incredible. And one of the things about we had a very, very intensive measure for the alcohol and drug consumption use. It's very, very detailed data. One of the things that was really impressed upon me, how different people are on what they get addicted to. Because it was amazing, because we'd ask everybody, have you tried, and all these different things. And there were people who tried heroin, and women would just be like, yeah, it didn't do much for me. And it was fine, but I only did it twice, And then you'd have somebody I had this one woman who, her favorite thing was inhaling paint. And she lost custody of all three of her kids inhaling paint. And she said, my mom started calling me Little Dutch Boy because I loved the blue Little Dutch Boy paint. And she said, I used alcohol, I used all sorts of different drugs, but for some reason, inhaling the paint, man, that was it for me. Some people, meth, not surprisingly. Some other people tried meth, didn't care about it. So to me, that is really important to understand. I mean, I am not an expert on this, but it was very fascinating just to hear. And then there were a lot of people, it was alcohol. They had tried every drug in the world. They liked some, they loved some, but it was alcohol that they had the problem with for a lot of the women. But there were also women who had a bunch of the combined substance use issues. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is we know from so much research about this risk factor of trauma to offending, we don't unpack it very well. We don't have enough research on how does that play out, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do with this research, especially with the life history calendars. But even doing the CD interviews before doing the life history calendars, it was really interesting how many, because when we'd say this thing about, so this first question, when did you first start hearing, if they said they were hearing the voices, tell me about the first time. One of the women I interviewed, she was 51, and again, this was somebody I did not think was going to be seriously mental ill in my little test I had with myself. And she walked in, a really sweet, sweet woman, and she said, well, when I was 15, she goes, yeah, I remember the first time it happened. And she said, I was 15 and I was pregnant, and my boyfriend locked me in a crypt overnight. He worked at a graveyard. And she said, I didn't even know if he was going to come and get me in the morning. I thought I was going to probably die there that night. And she said, that's when I started hearing voices, and I've heard them ever since. And she said, I don't hear them every day, but she said that was the beginning of it. Another woman that I interviewed, this was a Latina woman, the one that had been locked in the crypt. I'm just saying this because this went completely across race and ethnicity. I mean, it was for every race and ethnicity. And then another white woman I interviewed, when I asked about when she had triggered into some of the serious mental illness, but when I said, when did all this start happening for you? And she said, well, when I was 16, my mom died, and that was really traumatic. It was very sudden. The night of her funeral, my boyfriend raped me, and that was my first sexual experience. And she said, I just went crazy after that. And I went out that night, I drank a whole lot, I did a lot of drugs, and I've never been the same. And so to me, to me, anecdotally, and then we'll look at some of the stuff from the life history calendars, it definitely seemed like a lot of times when we did these interviews, a trauma triggered the first episode. It didn't always, but a trauma did. And so it does make you wonder, okay, was this something that was inevitable, that was going to happen? And I don't know enough about this, but it definitely did. On the other hand, there was a woman that I was interviewing, and when I asked the question about hearing voices, she said, oh yeah, and this was not trauma. She said, I said, when's the first time it happened? She goes, oh, I was about 14, and I'm lying in bed, and the fan's going, it's the summer, my cat's on my bed, and I hear voices from the fan. And at first I thought, oh my gosh, what the heck's going on? But my cat had supersonic hearing, and he obviously didn't hear the fan, so I knew it was a special gift I had. And that interview became more and more interesting as it went on. But clearly that was not a trauma-invoked one. So just looking at these lifetime and prevalence rates, the prevalence for the general population is 10% having PTSD. Oh, one thing I wanted to say about this last one too is it's kind of weird with the differences between the states here on the levels of this, which we found kind of odd, but then Shannon Lynch, the principal investigator on the grant, found some national statistics that actually show differences in the states too. That were similar to ours in the general population, which we're not really sure why that would be different by state to have some of the serious mental illness ones. So here you can just see, so 32% of the women in the 12-month period prior to incarceration had what qualified as serious mental illness. 43% had a lifetime percent. I mean, this is some majorly messed up people. And I guess that's not a very politically correct way to say this, but it truly, I cannot emphasize how overwhelming it was to do these interviews. And I really haven't been exposed to serious mental illness that much in my life. And hearing these stories were so sad. And it was one of those things, a lot of times you felt not only so bad for the person who had this, but you kept thinking, oh my God, for their parents, for their siblings, for their children, just incredibly sad. The bipolar, 8% versus 15%, and schizophrenia was the same, and then a brief psychotic disorder. When we looked at the substance use, again, 82% at some point in their life, and whereas the general population, according to some statistics that Shannon found, were 29%. But current for the 12 months before that, it was kind of interesting to me how many of the women, I mean, some of them had 12-step programs, had really helped them. Some of them had just kind of quit on their own. And interestingly, a lot of the women talked about the only times that they had been clean were when they were pregnant. That it was that they would say, well, once I found out I was pregnant, I quit using, and which I always found that so interesting how many, and Beth has this, my graduate student, in the paper she's doing working on mothering. And a lot of them had kicked alcohol, that they had been major practicing alcoholics and were not practicing anymore, and had lots of different ways of doing that. This is just another way, and you have all of these in your handouts, of just looking at the comorbidity of these different things. And some of the other ways of looking at this is that only 9% of the sample did not meet criteria for any of the lifetime things, which is just pretty remarkable when you think about it. Looking at the incidence, meaning the 12 months before jail, 30% did not meet any of these criteria. Part of what we also looked at, for every serious mental illness they reported PTSD and substance use disorder, we had a measure that to look at how much it affected their lives. And there was severe functional impairment in the last year for 25% of it. And this would be things like, I can't leave the house to go grocery shopping. I don't have contact, I don't have a social life anymore. It'd be those kind of questions. And you could definitely understand why. We did not find any significant difference between the urban and rural jails in terms of the serious mental illness and trauma overall. We did find regional differences, that Idaho reported the highest serious mental illness, and Maryland and Virginia the lowest. And again, this was, at first we just thought, oh God, was this a difference in the interviewers and whatnot, but then we found it was similar to these, which Shannon was very relieved when she found these other rates. So then looking at what kind of charges somebody had by serious mental illness and the kind of traumas and violent victimizations they'd experienced, women with a violent offense, and remember that was 16%, right, of the sample, were more likely than women with non-violent offenses to meet the criteria for serious mental illness. So serious mental illness does seem to be strongly related, which probably is not a surprise. That's one of my friends sometimes says whenever I tell her what I'm finding in my studies. The government paid $500,000 to find that out, duh. And I did feel like that with a lot of our findings. Whoops. Always good to get it confirmed though, right? So the women with serious mental illness were significantly more likely at the 0.001 level to report child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, caregiver incarceration, caregiver addiction, witnessing of violence, attacked as an adult, adult intimate partner abuse, and adult sexual violence. So all of those things were significantly more likely with women who had serious mental illness. When we asked the women whenever they talked about if they tested into having substance problems or mental health problems, we would ask them about whether they had talked to a professional about it before coming to jail. And so this just kind of gives you this percent of that. And the percent, this number here is that was the number, the numerator. That's the one I put there just in case you're interested in this. And then whether they thought it was effective or not. And it was pretty interesting to me here. We didn't have, I'm sorry, I just realized I can't remember why we don't have this one here. But anyway, you can see that a lot of the women, did find at least it somewhat effective. And some of the stories they told were pretty powerful there about, oh my God, I was sent to this thing. Some of the older women that we interviewed before the Reagan era of getting rid of all the mental institutions, or most of them, would talk about, when I was 16, my parents would bring me down to this place until I got better again, and they got me on the right medication and did this and that. And then I'd come back home. Well, now they don't have that anymore, so now I just end up in jail all the time. a lot of the staff told us things like these police officers will bring the women in because they're like, she's going to freeze to death if I don't bring her in. There's a blizzard and she's sleeping on the bench in the park. And some of the women would tell us this. The cop's like, I can't leave you out here. And she's like, okay, bring me in for loitering. So these kind of, and the very first woman I interviewed, which was one of my most deeply, seriously mentally ill, which she kept walking around the office the whole time I was interviewing her. It was like working in daycare. But she kept saying, I got to get back to my babies at the beginning of the interview. Well, it ended up she lived in a park, and it was the squirrels in the trees that were her babies. Oh my God, unbelievable life. But so anyway, so this percent reported having been hospitalized specifically for depression, for bipolar PTSD, psychotic spectrum, of those that had it, and then medication, having gotten it. And it kind of reminded me in a way with some of this, sometimes when I've interviewed delinquents, and they've told me about one particular teacher really helped them. Like, they may have had all sorts of horrible school experiences. And I always think this is important to tell my undergraduates because, you know, there really can, even though they ended up in a delinquent institution, they did have this one person that believed in them. A lot of the women talked about, oh my God, I saw a whole bunch of different professionals, but this one finally understood who I was. Or this one finally asked about my abuse victimization as a kid. One thing that was really heartening was how many of the women talked about how good the staff in the jail were, the social worker and the psychologists. But when we talked to the social workers and psychologists, they said one of the problems about jail is it could be that they're going to get out of here and they don't even know it the next day. You know, just things can happen they can in prison too, obviously, but much more so in jail. It can be, so here we are stirring up all this, you know, horrible trauma that they've repressed or just, and then they're out the door and have no more access to it. Another thing that struck me in Colorado was the sheriff's department was so clued in on the serious mental illness part that they actually gave money to the jail system to pay for the prescription drugs for people for the month they were getting out of jail. And to me, that just speaks volumes about how they get it, serious problem. So just the summary from this is that 43% of the women in our sample met the lifetime criteria for serious mental illness, 32% in the past 12 months. The participants endorsed high rates of co-occurring disorders. 25% had serious functional impairment. 50% of the offenders had access to mental health and substance abuse prior to incarceration, varied by region. Women with serious mental illness were more likely to report higher rates of prior violent victimization, repeat offenses, and to be charged with violent crimes. So clearly this strong connection between serious mental illness and offending, especially for violent crimes. So then moving into the life history calendar, I don't know, how many people are here are familiar with these? Because I had never done this type of research design before, and I'm a huge fan of it now. So Dana Dehart is this expert on this. So again, of the 491 women, we did a random sample of, it was supposed to be 30 women at each site, but Washington, D.C. ended up doing 15. So, so this is this qualitative life calendar, and I have some slides on this that aren't just to show you. And to look at these things of household, partners, substance use, crime victimization, adverse events, and services. So it's this whole grid. In this study, the women range from 17 to 55, again with a median or a mean age of 34. Median income was $15,000, and most had some high school or college. And then that was the racial breakdown, which was pretty similar. So this is just to show you, I have a couple different slides on this because I'm just such a big fan of this type of this method, the life history calendar, life events calendar. It's called different things. And Dana had done this with delinquent girls before, but she hadn't done it with adults, which we all ended up finding had its unique set of problems, which I'll talk briefly about. But she had these things on this big sheet of paper was this big grid that looked kind of like, this is more what the data looked like, and so the columns were time periods, and the rows were life events. So the first one was where the person lived, and then the second one was what schools they went to, and where they lived, you would also write who they lived with, like, you know, was it their grandmother, or was it their mother and father, whoever. what we found, and the reason you start out like that is then it makes it easier for people to remember when you ask, oh, were you sexually abused? Yes, it was Uncle so-and-so. How old were you? I'm not sure. What house were you living in? Do you remember where you were going to school? The other thing about this, as a feminist researcher, I loved the collaborative part of it, that we would sit, and some of them said, you just fill it out, but some of them would like to help, liked helping me fill it out. And almost everybody, IRBs, are you listening? Almost every time at the end of the interview, women were like, oh my God, I just feel like I have this whole new sense of my life that I didn't have before. And my graduate students and I actually all did it for ourselves, and we kind of felt the same way. That it was this thing where you just kind of like, wow, this is amazing. And because it's such a depressing interview to do, we always try to end on strength building kind of questions. And so at the end of this one, we asked, what kind of things do you do to make yourself feel better? What empowers you in your life? Of course, some of those were criminal, but anyway. Oops. The other thing we did at the very beginning, we would say, what are the 2 or 3 most significant events of your life? And we would put those in first. I should have said that. So for a lot of the women, it would be saying having my kid. It was amazing how many said getting my GED, which I just seems an important thing. And I feel like a lot of times GEDs get really minimized and looked down, and this is such an important thing. So we would have this Excel file that we would fill in all of this stuff about. So here, like for this person, so the first column was age 0 to 5, then it was 6 to 11, 12 to, I think it was 17 or 18, and then 18. What we found, Dana said this is so much harder with the adult women because there's just so many more years to remember. You know how it's much easier when you're 18 to remember oh yeah, that was when I was 16, now not so easy. So, and then some of the women would get really cranky, understand, like this second life history calendar I did, this woman said, do you remember how old you were, every single thing that happened to you in your whole life? And I'm like, no, sorry. But she got really, really annoyed with the life history calendar, but most of them liked it, they kind of got into it. So then at the last, so we fill all of this into an Excel file, and then we'd also have a Word document where we would write a sort of narrative about each thing so that we had, and some of us took it as much first person as we could, which I'm really a first person gal, was trying to get because some of these quotes were just so remarkable. And other people, Dana was more like, she this, she that. S was on parole for owing money to her probation officer. He evaluated her for owing the money, and someone had stolen the wallet identity. So here we tried to tell their stories as much as we could. So it was really important to do these right afterwards. We weren't allowed to tape them. We weren't allowed to bring computers in. Yeah. So it was really important to get these into files, to type these up as soon as we possibly could. And as Dana said, never do more than 2 a day. And it was really true. I have to say, there were days I literally cried the entire way back from Denver to Boulder, that some of the interviews had been so horrific. So one of the other things so this is just an example here of, so we have the school, the household, the job, the victimization, alcohol and drugs. So this is kind of what it would look like here. Abortion at age 15, son at 16, lost twins in a crash at 18. So these different kinds of things that were in this Excel file like this. And then, and this is all Dana D. Hart. I can't take any credit for this, who's just like unbelievable with this life history calendar. And I didn't put all this in your slides, but if anybody wants this, you can let me know. But I think it's just an incredibly amazing way at getting at this, at getting both some really amazing qualitative data, but also the timing so we can better sequence. Okay, we know these things are related, but how? So in looking at these, 50% had some kind of, of the women that did the life history calendars, it ended up 50% had a prevalence of any serious mental illness, and 51% from the CD, from the structured interviews, had PTSD, and then 85%, so it's not completely representative of what our CD sample was, but that's the way it goes. With the trauma data, from what they reported in there, as opposed to this is what our sample for the LHC is what we got from the prior survey, 60% reported caregiver violence or neglect, 77% reported partner violence, and a lot of this was actually when they were even 12 years old, being raped, beaten up, and a lot of times it was older boyfriends. And there was also some same-sex relationship stuff there too. Non-family violence, bullying, assaults, sexual violence, child and adulthood, 86%. Witnessing violence, and a lot of this was kids watching their mothers being beat to hell and back, seeing a dead body, seeing a murder, and then the parents' death, addiction, other kinds of childhood events that were very hard. So in the life history analysis, Dr. DeHart used survivor analysis to examine these risk factors. So a steep slope for a person with SMI, which is going to be the dotted line in these slides, will indicate a greater rate of the event in question, and the first one's going to be running away. High risk and important times for support and services to address trauma. We found a strong persistent pattern of those with SMI being at greater risk for many types of crime and delinquency, but not all of them, as you'll see, such as substance use, drug dealing, trends for assault, property crimes. So women's qualitative accounts indicated that mental health problems were often associated with the experience of victimization as well as their self-medicating. And so it wasn't really, like, sometimes when I listen to their stories, it's like, oh man, I totally would have been on meth too. Like, it's just, especially if you don't have access to health care, and the only people you have access to help you are, one of my graduate students interviewed this woman that she had been in a really middle-class family, and then the dad left when she was 8 and just quit giving any money to the mom. And it might have been because the mom, she wasn't sure, was actually an alcoholic already. I mean, not that this justifies what the dad leaving and not providing any support. The mom, after he had been gone a few months, you know, they've moved, they're getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And her mom took her to a bar, and she sat in the car and sold her to a man in the bar to have sex with, to rape her. You know, these kind of stories just, oh my God, they were just, how isn't somebody like that going to end up having substance use disorders? That's kind of hard to imagine. Another thing that was so overwhelming was when we were asking where they lived, so many of them were homeless during parts of their childhood, and much of the time that we were in here, I mean, one of the women told me, I live in a train car. Do you want an address for there? There isn't one. It's an old abandoned train car. Another woman, I live in a tent. I move it around all the time once I think the police are getting close. Just unbelievable stories. So the women with serious mental illness were more likely to run away, and this peaked in the early teens. This is in your handout, but then I'm going to just show you some of these slides. They're more likely to fight with and assault others. They're more likely to deal drugs and have drug charges. Women with caregiver violence were 9 times more likely to run away. Again, not a big surprise there, but still 9 times, that's a lot. Women who witness violence were twice as likely to fight with or assault others, and 8 times as likely to carry or use a weapon. Women with violent partners were twice as likely to deal drugs, have drug charges, 4 times as likely to do sex work. And it was some of the other research that's been coming out really recently on this too is showing these women who don't have the whole childhood delinquency thing, but their offending, or at least being labeled offenders, starts becoming a victim of domestic violence, where they are, you know, coerced, forced into selling drugs, doing different things like this, prostituting and so on. Women with substance use disorder were 6 times as likely to do sex work. So here are just some of the slides from this, that the serious mental illness is the dotted line here. And we can see the greatest risk, it just goes between the 6 to 11 here is just the greatest risk in early 20s. Again, not a big surprise there, but then this next slide has this, but it's taking into account women with caregiver violence. So the blue line is the women without caregiver violence. The green line is the women who had caregiver violence while they were growing up. And there are these straight, because of, again, we had these time periods in our big grid of the birth to 5-year-olds, 6 to 11, 12 to 15, 16 to 19, and so on. The women with serious mental illness were at a higher risk of fighting and assaulting others. And then if we look at this here, the women who witnessed violence, and this is I had this on the slide before, but just so visually you can see how this worked. The women who witnessed violence were twice as likely to engage in physical and fighting assaults. When I was interviewing the staff in the jail, it was really interesting some of the things they said, because they said one of the problems with having really seriously mentally ill people in the jail is that some of them are much more likely to be the people that are preying on or being violent towards the other inmates. Oh, sorry, is that the 10-minute warning? Okay, thank you. I could go on all day. I asked him to give me a little clue. Thank you. And so some of the women were incredibly violent towards the other inmates, and some of the stories were actually really scary, including some that some of the inmates, that some of our participants told us, but also that some of the staff told us about too. But also some of the seriously mentally ill were the most at risk for being victimized because they were so mentally ill. So the stories from the staff and also from some of the other participants really were just mind-numbing. So then here we can say women who witness violence. There's not a big difference between the seriously mentally ill, I don't think this was significant here, about whether somebody used weapons or not. Not a big difference there, but we do see a big difference with whether somebody witnessed violence or not. And a lot of like one of the women I interviewed talked about her best friend. He was stabbed in front. She was in college. She'd had a horrible life, raped by her uncle repeatedly. Somebody told her aunt, who he actually went to court over it, and got no time in jail for it, even though he'd also been convicted of raping one of her cousins, which she knew nothing about this 10 years earlier. And according to her, he moved to Tennessee because they don't follow the records there, so nothing happened to him. It sounded to me like the rapes were anal. I mean, she didn't come right out and say this, but all of these things, because she talked about not having to worry about being pregnant. But she was a sex worker, a street prostitute. And she said, that's the one thing I will not do. And she said, and with my lovers, it's like, she had a bunch of lines for that. But she talked about the worst thing. One of the worst things was she was going to go to nursing school. This was her goal. And her best friend was stabbed. And she said, and I couldn't even help him. He died. And I just thought, why am I going to, here I am studying to go to nursing school, and I can't even stop my friend from dying. And so these kind of, and she always carried a knife. She had a horrible story about them. Again, when people say, how do you know they're not lying to you? They told me some of the most, and she was one of those people, I really, how you do this, you're like, oh, I like you so much, you're so great. And then like, oh my gosh. But she told me, like, when she would need money, she said, one time I just go in this alley, and she was a heroin addict, and she said she would go, she went in this alley one time, and she was just so desperate for money, and she saw this really rich woman going with this big purse, and she said, I'm HIV positive, which she wasn't, but she said, if you don't give me your purse, I'm going to inject this, and you're going to be HIV positive. And I mean, right? So a woman gave her a purse. Good idea. But, so there were these kinds of things, but this was the same woman who had wanted to go to nursing school and so on. Here we can see women with serious mental illness at higher risk of dealing drugs or having drug charges, and then partner violence. The women without the partner violence are blue, the women with are green here. And then here, looking at the onset of sex work, really not related to serious mental illness, not significantly different there. But women with SUD were 6 times more likely to be doing sex work. And a lot of them would talk about, I had to do sex work to afford my drugs. That's the only way I could do it. Or I got pimped out. Women with partner violence were 4 times the risk of doing sex work. And a lot of times their partners were pimps. And there were some horrible stories with that, as you can imagine. women with substance use disorder were 7 times as likely to have DUIs and drive under suspension. And then, but you see the SMI lower actually there. And then just some of the summary of some of the regressions that Dr. Hart did here of the caregiver violence, the violence, just looking at what were some of the predicting things here, how caregiver violence is obviously important, and serious mental illness for running away, and witnessing violence was very important for assault, and for serious mental illness it was a trend. Weapons, witnessing violence, explained a ton of that, which makes a lot of sense. Drug offenses, partner violence, and serious mental illness. Sex work, partner violence, and substance use disorder, DUI, substance use disorder. So just, I love this method at just being able to tease out some of these different relationships like this. So that overall, the last thing I want to do, I was hoping I was going to have time for this, which I think I do. So the last, okay, 5 minutes, great. So the last thing we did was interviewed the staff, and this was a range of line staff to PhDs and an MD, nurses, all sorts of things. One thing that we were all really surprised about, and it varied a little bit by region, but that many of these people were incredibly sympathetic to the women and had these just amazing stories. Now, we were not allowed to randomly sample, so that might be who we got, but still, we were just amazed. And my favorite story, I feel like I always have to tell this, was one of the psychiatric nurses I interviewed. And she said, you know, I just tell these women that are really mentally ill that when they come in here, you know, we live in Colorado, and you know when you go hiking, you're just you're in these forests with all these really, really tall pine trees, and you're just like, wow. And then you see a rock, either 2 big rocks next to each other, or a rock with a crack in it, and there's this little tiny like bonsai tree growing out of it. And you're like, oh my God, what a miracle. How did this little seed happen to grow with all of this? And she said, you're the little bonsai tree. And you know, you're never gonna be the big tree because you have this mental illness. But this is amazing. This is amazing that this tree could grow and be here all this time. And there were just these kinds of things that and a number of the women participants told us of these amazing breakthroughs they had with the social worker, psychologist, psychiatric nurse that was so humbling and encouraging. Of course, some had some awful stories, but I just thought that it's really important to say that they definitely recognize that serious mental illness and trauma are hugely a problem. Nobody didn't think this wasn't a problem among the people that we interviewed. The women's need for and the lack of the resources before, after, and sometimes during incarceration, safe housing was huge, like so many of the women told us, but also the staff. The person they have to go back to is their pimp. The person they have to go back to is the very abusive partner. And then some of the women would tell us, I can live in this place, but it's they've got lice. There's all these people dealing drugs there. It was almost impossible. Drug and alcohol recovery programs, self-empowerment programs, educational resources, and some of the jailed women really, and a lot of other research has said this, but this is the only way they can get their basic mental and physical health needs met. And there's a lot of research on as physically ill and mentally ill as incarcerated men are, women's health is so much worse on both counts, is significantly worse. Almost all of this research shows this. So it's just really important. So of course, what I'm advocating for here, what we're doing is, we definitely need more money in these interventions when kids are abused, those kinds of things. We definitely need more. And for the mental illness institutions, as much as people were like, oh my God, those were horrible holding tanks and everything, to have merged those with prisons and jails has made the problem so much worse. And it's made it much harder for police officers too, that just feel like, what am I gonna do with this person? That's gonna either get killed on the street or whatever. And as one of the people I interviewed, a psychiatrist said to me, we say here that the jails are the second biggest mental illness institution in the state, prisons are the biggest one. And that is a problem. I don't see how anybody can't see that as a problem. So I think that pretty much covers everything I was going to do in a timely manner. Okay, good. So I'm really eager to hear your questions and comments and everything else. So thank you.
Thank you, and it was an extraordinarily enlightening and disturbing at the same time presentation. Questions, please. Matt, always the steady questioner.
Good morning. Thanks for being here again. Tremendously interesting talk. Lots of great stories, and I think the data that you've generated has given us a lot to think about, particularly salient policy implications. And so, since you've talked so much about that, and that's really a particular strength of the talk, I'd like to ask you about something different. I'm interested in particular if, through the course of working on the project and all the data that you've generated, if you have some perspectives on theory, and so maybe a statement about theoretical integration or competition or extension. How does this work get more into the mainstream and more attention from criminologists everywhere?
Yeah, thank you. Great
Thanks.
question. And so to me it was so fascinating when BJA/DOJ put out this RFP for pathways research, because I'm like, oh my God, we've been calling it that, and I'm one of the first people, Kathy Daly I think was the first person who actually labeled it, but that we've been calling it that forever, and now BJA is even calling it this, but they didn't say theory or perspective, it was just pathways. And, but we, when I'm teaching about this in my graduate and undergraduate classes, I always say, when you look at Whittam's cycle of violence, you look at life course perspective theory, and even general strain theory, I think it's so, that in many ways they're all, and pathways, they're all pretty much saying some similar things about what are these events that happen that put people at risk of offending. And a part of that too, looking at cycle of violence, and this is, and so then with offending, what puts you at risk of further trauma too. And one of the things I love to do, especially in my undergraduate class, is compare pathways with life course, and talk about how the incredible differences, like pathways has mostly been feminist researchers doing retrospective research, where it's harder to get the timing and everything, but has focused way more on victimization and has been predominantly with girls and women. Life course, prospective, much better research design, much better for timing, been largely on boys, but it doesn't get at a lot of the victimization stuff as well. And even general strain theory, I just feel like it, the strain of abuse and violence and witnessing violence and these things, I mean, I read a lot of this literature, and I feel like we're just not getting that. So one of my students said the last time I was teaching this a year ago, he said, so really what we need to do is basically life course analysis, or the life course, but make sure we're really getting at all of these things. And I said, life course is incredibly expensive to do, and it's really hard to follow these kind of populations, as we all know. And then I just keep thinking, even if they had interviewed these women when they were girls, would they have told them, my uncle is raping me, my parents we have people at the house all the time with guns that, because my parents deal drugs. I mean, to me, all of those theories all have such an important part of them, but I feel like as a group, they are just way too often missing a lot of the really serious traumatic events. And how those are going to be, in many ways, like what are the class and race, class-based particularly, ways that kids are not going to have access to help for things. I always tell people, when I had breast cancer and my son was 7, his school, and he went to public school, but all the teachers were like, how can we help? All my neighbors, how can we help? My colleagues, how can we help? If you were a poor single mother and and your school, where do you get all of that? I really do feel like, how would I have gotten through that? But to me, theoretically, it's saying general strain theory really needs to get better on doing abuse and trauma victimization. And we also have to look at more, once you're an offender, what are these risks for additional trauma? And but we need to put a lot of money in there about looking at this. But again, the prospective part is, how often are your kids going to actually tell you the things that happen. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So I want to, are we good, Dennis, on the mic? On, good. So I want to echo the gratitude of my colleagues. First of all, thank you for coming and joining us and giving a very interesting talk. It's always a pleasure to have folks of your stature come in and speak to us, so thank you. As I was listening to you, describe the study and data collection and all of that, I was struck by a number of things. Probably the biggest of which was how closely it accords with the work of folks like Terry Moffat and Absalom Caspi and even Kathy Spatz-Whittam more recently regarding stressful life events as a trigger for biological risk factors. And I'm wondering just first your thoughts about that, and I guess it kind of dovetails with what you were talking about, describing the role of theory in all of this, but I'd be curious to hear just broadly your thoughts on that particular issue.
Yeah, great, another great question. And I used to be really afraid of that biological stuff because I feel like, and I still am to some extent, I feel like sometimes it's been used so much to have really gendered, raced perspectives and labeling that I find are really frightening. So at the same time, clearly these mental illnesses, there is a genetic and or biological thing going. I mean, there is just no doubt about something really. And I have this colleague, Jason Boardman, who he was on your committee too, right? And he's not a criminologist, but we've started doing more and more research together and sharing more and more graduate students. But he does a lot of the genetic and different things like that. I do think it is really, the more I do interdisciplinary work, the more I just fall in love with it. That with this, I could have never done this study. I couldn't have designed this study because I didn't have this psych background. But I sure as heck helped with, we were 204 of the sample of 491. And so, but to me, merging that is so important. And Jason and I have been talking about how we want to start doing this. And the psychiatrist at the Denver County Jail is really interested in it too. So I do think it is so important to do that work and become more integrative. I have been, and I've written some about that, I have been really troubled how I feel like some of that is used sometimes, where I feel like what the measures people are using is really more a measure of poverty, but they're such as infant mortality and some of the things like that. I worry sometimes that some of the measures are not so much these biological, but are more poverty, but they're used as biological. And so I think we have to be really careful, but we do with everything we do. But that is definitely important. And again, I have such a huge new respect for the profoundness of serious mental illness. It's so sad.
Thank you again for coming. I really enjoyed listening to your talk. I have kind of a two-part question.
Okay.
I think in feminist research, we look a lot at blurred boundaries and this dual status of being a victim and an offender. But I've been recently reading some research, mostly with prostituted youth, that has talked about maybe adding a third component to that, which is that of survivor. And some qualitative interviews with these youth they've discussed, being a victim, but also feeling as though they are a survivor because they have managed to be so independent on the streets and independent in dealing with these traumatic events. And I'm wondering whether you may not have asked about this, but whether the women, that theme came up in talking with the women, resiliency and being a survivor.
We didn't specifically ask about it, and there were so many other things we wanted to put in this, and we ended up having to not include, because the survey, especially if they tricked into a bunch of the different mental illnesses and traumas, which many of them did, the interviews were well over 6 hours and we had to go more than one day to complete them. But to me, that is a fascinating piece. And when Emily Gardner, one of my former graduate students, a piece we have in criminology about girls whose cases were waived to adult court and convicted and were serving time in an adult women's prison, we kept toying with that too, because in some ways they did seem like just amazing survivors. One of the reviewers, when we were trying to get it published, kept saying we weren't talking about their agency enough, their self-determination. And part of it was we would talk like, oh my God, like one of these girls, She was 3 years old when the police went to this apartment. They had no idea how long she'd been alone in there. And there were only dogs and dog feces in the apartment. And hardly any food was left in the refrigerator. She went from one foster home to another. And I'm like, really, how much agency does somebody like that have? It's just, and so as a feminist, I feel like I don't like just calling people victims. I don't like denying agency. I don't want to say, oh, we should just let them get away with this. I just published something in Homicide Studies about women who kill their male partners. It was both ways, but I mean, some of these women, scary. You know, so I do think we do have to, just like we have to be interdisciplinary and inclusive by all of these different things and the ways we do our study. How you get at that, I think, is really, really hard. Many of these women I interviewed, I just thought, oh my God, they really are survivors. But I have to tell you, one of the things that was so depressing about doing this study was feeling like when you do these interviews that I would just tell myself, oh my God, that woman's gonna be dead in a year. And a lot of times these were women in their early 20s. Like, she's heroin addicted, she's living on the streets, and she's told me, I had to kick heroin when I came in here because, which is a really hard thing to do. So they say, and I believe it. And like this one woman told me, every time I've been in jail or prison, I have to kick it, but then I tell myself, okay, now I've kicked it, I'm gonna stay clean out on the streets. But she said, I don't. And she goes, now I know I won't. Now it's just like, oh God, here I am going through this whole withdrawal and thing and everything. And so I do think, you know, as feminist researchers, as all researchers, I mean, how we define who they are is really important. But I also, there's times I feel like, oh my God, we get so much into survivor. How much are we denying the impact of these really horrific victimizations? And one thing I've always been amazed about doing these interviews, not just this study, but is how some people can just tell you the most god-awful things that happen to you as if they're telling you what they had for lunch that day. And Stephanie Covington, who does a lot of research on this, will talk about, you know, that's part of how people cope. Like, some people remember it, they don't repress the memory, but they remember it without emotions. And but the problem with that is that they kind of have shut down all their emotions. You can't just selectively let in emotions. Again, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't completely understand all this, but I think that whole idea about agency is important, about survivor versus victim. I think what labels we as researchers put on people. But I found myself at the end of almost every interview, especially these women, I thought, oh my God, you are gonna be dead so soon. Was just saying, I really, really hope you can get it together. I just want you to know, you know, and it was always really intense, but the graduate students felt the same way too. It's like, oh my God, this is going to be one of those women that they're going to find, you know, stabbed to death or OD'd or whatever, and yeah. Sorry. Did that answer both of your questions?
It did.
Okay.
I was just curious at how they identified themselves.
Yeah, it's funny, we thought we were so hip using the word sex work all the time, and they're like, sex work? Oh, pros. The first woman I interviewed, this was hilarious. No, the second woman I interviewed, one of the first questions we said, what are you in for? And she said, DUI and prostitution, can't walk or drive. So, nobody can say they didn't have a sense of humor. There were some hilarious, I was telling some stories at dinner last night. As horrific and awful as some of this was, there were times that we laughed, including during the interview, some of the women would say stuff that it would just be such a connection about something that was so funny. But I think what was really sad was I did feel like a lot of them really did want to wanted to get out, get their kids back, get their lives back together, but were really worried how the hell they were going to do it. And one of the things I was saying at breakfast this morning that we did after the first couple of interviews, we made this sheet of that we gave out even for the women who didn't want to be in our study, that of resources that we listed them by, you know, where to get clothes, where to get where they can stay, where to look for jobs, where to have access to computers, and just all these things. And it was amazing how grateful they were for this. And I kind of thought, gosh, why isn't this just happening already? But also telling them if they came in without an ID, like a lot of them, you know, just came in under these bizarre circumstances. And it could be that the woman I talked about whose face was all beat up, abuser got a new girlfriend who would call her and tell her that she was selling all of her stuff on Craigslist. And, and she didn't have her wallet, so she doesn't have an ID. And it's expensive to get a new ID. So.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Lisa. I'm with the Student Health Center, and I have a background in public health.
Oh, great.
Our society doesn't really believe in prevention, but I think that so many aspects of public health, criminal justice, psychology, if we could do some prevention, I'm curious to know what thoughts maybe your research group has possibly come up with. If they said, if we could just do one thing, if we could do some kind of prevention, some kind of advocacy, where could we start to stop this cycle that seems to keep repeating itself?
Like one of the things, I just feel like it has to be mandatory in schools about the, of having groups come in and talk about these different kinds of traumas, including, watching a parent beat the hell out of another parent. And my experience, and this is more anecdotal, but somewhat with my research, is that it has to be, that the teachers will report it after, some of my undergraduate students who work in after-school programs, that, oh, well, this doesn't reach to the level that we really care that much about. A father who pulled the hair out of his kids. They had these 3 little blonde-haired kids with patches of hair out all over, and that just wasn't considered a bad enough violation. They sort of looked into it. The mother was distraught and said, yes, I keep reporting this. So I feel like, so we have some of this stuff, but I think, the social workers are too overwhelmed. I guess that's what it is, because I can't believe people don't care about that hear about these cases. But that's so many, and so what does that do to a kid to report it, and then no problem. One of my former, what's that noise? One of my former students said she started as a social worker, and this was years ago from when I was in Cincinnati and from the 80s, and she said, I get this thing where a father put a pencil eraser in his 4-year-old son's anus, and that wasn't with all the important things we had to deal with, that wasn't considered, we couldn't address that one. And she said, and it was true. We had so many cases and so little staff. What is wrong when we don't make the resources for this?
We have to educate them and say, some of it, you would think that would be common sense. You don't do stuff like that to a child.
Right. And
so do we need to come out and have classes and say, don't treat your kids like this?
And I do think more high schools are doing some of this living on your own, being better parents and stuff like that. So, and I think that can only be a good thing. Another thing that I am really into is the bystander training, just how much we are accustomed to not say anything when we see somebody smack their kid or say something awful. Or I was giving a talk last week on campus, and the other speaker was telling the college women in the room not to drink with strangers, and more or less that it was going to be their fault if they were raped. Of course, I went ballistic. And it was like, she said, well, we need to teach the women not to drink. And I said, first of all, they're more at risk in front of people they know. And also, we need to teach people not to rape. And what happened to that old-fashioned idea? And then I said, but we also need to teach people that you say, my God, quit hitting on her, she's drunk. And to me, we have to do this kind of community building stuff too, but it definitely, so the prevention part, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's going to save more money than what it costs. But yes, and I've been saying it for years. How many fewer people would be in prison and jail, but also how many more people would be alive because those people had actually the intervention they needed at the time they needed. Yeah. Thank you.
I wondered if there was, if you had run across some comparative studies.
I'm having a little hard time hearing you.
I wondered if you have run across some comparative studies in different countries and the services they offer in terms of prevention and so on and so forth, and what you found out in terms of the amount of violence in inter-country studies.
I'm actually going to Amsterdam this summer. Candace Krutchnet has a huge grant there to look specifically at this, what different places are doing. But my understanding is that those Scandinavian countries are just way ahead of everybody else in doing this. They just put way more money into it, and so they don't have the problems that, and I don't know if other people have more information on this, but what I've read, that seems to be the places that are doing the best on those things. Do you know of any? I mean, because I'm eager to hear about this too, about what, yeah, but it's Sweden in particular, I think, yeah. And that's what I keep thinking, there's no reason we can't do those things. We just, I mean, it's money. We need to make that commitment. Yeah.
As the keeper of time, and all of you know how good I am at time issues, I'm going to call the question. Thank you very much, and please join me again in welcoming and thanking Dr. Belknap.
Thank you all so much. This was great. Thank you.